Hi, everybody. I want to offer some brief remarks on James Baldwin's book, The Fire Next Time. Baldwin has been an outstanding voice in the debates and discussions that we've looked at in this course. I have to say, this work, his book, The Fire Next Time, is certainly one of my favorite in the course, and I hope that you find it also to be really engaging. Mainly, I want to look at some passages from that book and just introduce what I take to be some of the main themes in it. So let's get started. Here's Baldwin himself and the cover of his book. I'll put up on our e-learning page some other short videos about Baldwin so you can get a sense for him as a person in addition to what you'll learn about him in his experience from reading his book. He was born in 1924, died in 1987. James Baldwin was a writer, and that's probably the best way to put it. He was a writer's writer, in my estimation. He wrote novels and plays and essays. What we have from him here are two essays collected under this title, The Fire Next Time. Baldwin grew up in New York and Harlem, but he also lived in France on several occasions and did die in France. And France, especially Paris, was an important part of his experience and dare I say, perhaps his identity as well. He'll talk about that a bit in the book. He was a key influence on the civil rights movement, I say here on the slide, and a shaper of its legacy. He was a person who knew the kind of protagonists of that movement that we've been studying in this course. He was not himself always on the front lines or the most public figure in the context of marches and direct actions, but his thinking and the language and the really poetic expression, the powerful expression that he brought to the aims of the movement was of vital importance to it. This book in particular was published in a year that we've now spent quite a bit of time in, 1963. That was, of course, the year of King's letter from a Birmingham jail. It was the year of the March on Washington. It was just immediately before Malcolm's speech, the Ballad or the Bullet. And it was a very significant year in the history of this movement. It includes two essays, which were published independently before this book was collected. My Dungeon Shook and Down at the Cross. The first one is much shorter than the second one, but we'll say a bit about both of them as we move through these passages. They were published in magazines first before they were put together here in a book form. The first one, My Dungeon Shook, we should say a bit now, is written, as you'll see clearly from the first page, as a letter to Baldwin's nephew, who I believe is the person here depicted with him on the cover of this Penguin edition, this early Penguin edition of the book. And Baldwin is here speaking to his nephew as a black boy growing up in the United States in the early 1960s, and what this means, drawing on Baldwin's own experience to some degree. The language that he brings to this to articulate that experience through his own perspective is again, I propose to you, very powerful and still relevant in many ways today. The second, much longer essay, published kind of serially, in a few installments in a magazine prior to this book, is Down at the Cross. And this traces Baldwin's own experience as a young man involved in the Christian church. Later on, having kind of broken with that church, meeting with some members of the Nation of Islam. So we'll see some of those figures discussed here, including especially Elijah Muhammad, and then where all of that led him in terms of his experience. So what I want to do, as I say, is just walk through some of these passages. I think the other videos that I'll put up will tell you a bit more about Baldwin himself, give you some sense for him as a person and as a writer. And I think our time here is best spent just emphasizing, as I said at the top, some of the themes in the text. So I've tried to gather a set of passages here that relates to those themes. We start here near the end of Down at the Cross, the first shorter essay in the book, The Fire Next Time. And I've titled this one here, Brutal Clarity. You were born where you were born, Baldwin writes, and faced the future that you faced because you were black and for no other reason, All the italics throughout are from Baldwin. The limits of your ambition were thus expected to be set forever. You were born into a society which spelled out with brutal clarity, in as many ways as possible, that you were a worthless human being. You were not expected to aspire to excellence. You were expected to make peace with mediocrity. Baldwin himself certainly never did make peace with mediocrity, thank goodness, and he was a person who refused to let this brutal clarity, to let this message that he was so clearly getting from his own society, right, his country, our country, to hold him back or to prevent him from expanding the limits of his ambition. And we also see here the clear kind of moral message of Baldwin's book, as well as of the movement as a whole here, in the phrase, spelling out with brutal clarity that you were a worthless human being. In the kind of main line of the civil rights movement, what is a central concept? Human dignity. That all human beings, not just dignitaries, not just the powerful, right? Every single human being, regardless of any characteristic they may have, has dignity as a human being and ought to be treated with such, in that light. Baldwin himself, although he grew up in the Christian churches, as you'll see in the reading, did not himself remain a Christian. Theologically, then, in the context of our course, Theology of the Civil Rights Movement, Baldwin was not speaking as a religious author. He was speaking as a writer. He was speaking as a thinker, I dare say as a poet, out of an experience that included a great deal of engagement with religion, but which no longer spoke explicitly from that place. Acceptance and integration, a second theme, and this is taken from the very end, again, of that first essay, Down at the Cross. Please try to be clear, dear James. James is his nephew. Please try to be clear, dear James, through the storm which rages about your youthful head today, about the reality which lies behind the words acceptance and integration. There is no reason for you to try to become like white people, and there is no basis whatever for their impertinent assumption that they must accept you. The really terrible thing, old buddy, is that you must accept them. And I mean that very seriously. You must accept them and accept them with love. For these innocent people have no other hope. They are, in effect, still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. So here we are speaking at the beginning of the 1960s. Segregation is still very much in place throughout the American South and other parts of the country. And here we have James Baldwin saying, you must accept them, right? That is, white people who make this impertinent assumption that they must accept you, right? That you must accept them and accept them with love. They have no other hope. And then we have this word innocent. For these innocent people have no other hope. This is something I think for each one of us to think about. What here does Baldwin mean by innocent? Because certainly thinking about the social context of that time, thinking about the structures that were in place, including most of all segregation, including Jim Crow, including redlining, including the other practices of which today we're so conscious, rightly so. What does it mean for white people, referred to here as, to refer to white people here as innocent, right? That they have no other hope. I think to understand Baldwin's meaning here, and again, each of us can do this as we read his text, they are still trapped in a history which they do not understand. They are trapped. They think they are white, right? That there's a dividing line here between white and black, and the people aren't just people somehow, right? That somehow these white people are under the misapprehension. They're living in the fantasy world that somehow because they are white, they are more a person than a person who is not white. This is not only wrong and malicious misunderstanding, potentially malicious misunderstanding, but it's a crippling misunderstanding. I read Baldwin as saying here, they are trapped in this understanding of history, right? They do not understand the actual history of the country, and they need somehow to be released from that misunderstanding. 100 things here that we could discuss, and I'll leave the details of interpretation to each of us, but I would highlight this passage as an important one in Baldwin's book. Continuing with our theme about theology in our course, Theology of the Civil Rights Movement, here we've moved into the second essay. I've titled this passage here, A White God. The universe, Baldwin writes, which is not merely the stars and the moon and the planets, flowers, grass, and trees, but other people, has evolved no terms for your existence, has made no room for you. And if love will not swing wide the gates, no other power will or can. And if one despairs, as who has not, of human love, God's love alone is left. But God, I felt, this even then, so long ago, on that tremendous floor, unwillingly, is white. And if his love was so great, and if he loved all his children, why were we, the blacks, cast down so far? So here we have a recounting of the inner thoughts of a young James Baldwin, right? He's the universe includes other people, right? And if one despairs of love from those other people, well, okay, one is driven to somehow, as he suggests in his telling of this period of his life, one is driven to the love of God, right? Lacking love here, one looks elsewhere. However, what if one is told by these other people that are for one part of the universe, right, that he or she occupies? What if one is told that God is white, right? And how to reconcile this claim that God loves all of his children, right, with the manifest situation of Black Americans in this country. This is a highly disturbing series of reflections, and something that both, it seems, drove Baldwin into the church and eventually perhaps drove him out of the church, among other things. We'll have a little more on that. But certainly the depiction of God in a given culture, and of God, also of Jesus, of other characters such as Mary or Joseph or other individuals in the Catholic Church, for example, would call saints, to depict all of these people as, in the sense of 1962, as white, right, is to exclude all those who do not share that identity. And Baldwin is keenly aware of this, and so too might we be today. Depictions matter. This is a favorite passage, which I guess is maybe not among the most famous in the book, but it's one that I especially appreciate. Tasteless foam rubber. Here, James Baldwin is talking about Wonder Bread. All right, Wonder Bread, big old loaf of white sliced bread in a plastic bag, right? He writes, to be sensual, I think, is to respect and rejoice in the force of life itself, and to be present in all that one does, from the effort of loving to the baking of bread. It will be a great day for America, incidentally, when we begin to eat bread again, instead of the blasphemous and tasteless foam rubber that we have substituted for it. And I'm not being frivolous now either. Something very sinister happens to the people of a country when they begin to distrust their own reactions as deeply as they do here, and become as joyless as they have become. It's an old term used to talk about American society. People talk about mass society, right? Mass production. And what was something that was mass produced? Sliced bread, right? And specifically, well, the Wonder Bread is a specific brand of bread, right? But this kind of, he calls it tasteless foam rubber, this white loaf of bread. What he's talking about here are our sensations, our relation to our own body, right? And that when we eat this tasteless foam rubber and we think, yum, right? Baldwin is suggesting that this is evidence of an astonishing blindness on our part. Um, Real bread, right? Bread kneaded with human hands. Bread that is baked in an oven in one's home comes from one's. I mean, if one wants to be nostalgic about it, one's hearth, right? This is of an entirely different order than a plastic bag of foam rubber that one gets at the grocery store. The fact that this substitute for bread, which had become so widespread and was so popular in the early 1960s, should be accepted and thought to be perfectly fine for Baldwin is taken as evidence that the people in the United States had somehow separated themselves from their own physical reality, their own experience, right? And they were, how does he put it here? They've begun to distrust their own reactions, right? In order for racial justice to be achieved in this country, for us to, as we'll see in a moment, he say, achieve our country, right? We need to be aware of our own, what is it here? We need to respect and rejoice in the force of life and to be present in all that we do. And this is hard to do if we're living in a way that denies our physical experience. Back to the theme of theology and the churches. Baldwin writes the following. I've given it the heading, Larger, Freer, and More Loving. It is not too much to say, he writes, that whoever wishes to become wishes to become a truly moral human being, must first divorce himself from all the prohibitions, crimes, and hypocrisies of the Christian church. If the concept of God has any validity or any use, it can only be to make us larger, freer, and more loving. If God cannot do this, then it is time we got rid of him. So here we find Baldwin's, I don't know that we need to call it atheism. I'm not sure offhand what descriptor he would have used for it, at least agnosticism. And I would suggest also his kind of pragmatic approach to this question, right? What is the message of Christianity as understood, across the span? That somehow to be a Christian is a way of living a life that is larger and freer and more loving, right? And it's understood that somehow a relationship with God enables a person to do that. Well, what happens when, the prohibitions and crimes and hypocrisies of the real existing church and people who call themselves Christians in this world historically, what happens when those things actually prevent a person from being larger and freer and more loving? What happens when those prohibitions, etc., make us actually smaller and more constrained and less loving? Right? In that case, Baldwin says, you know, écraser la femme, l'infâme. Oh, what was that French phrase? Erase the infamy. So, goodness, I'm trying to refer to something from the French Revolution. Get rid of it, basically, right? Let's not rely on these institutions for their own sake, but only insofar as they accomplish what, on the label, so to speak, they set out to accomplish. A bit later on, I think we just have a few more of these. Learning to use one's history. And this is an important notion, I think today especially, as we've had so many interesting and important debates about the history of this country and how we interpret it. It's useful to keep in mind Baldwin's words here. He writes, to accept one's past, one's history, is not the same thing as drowning in it. It is learning how to use it. An invented past can never be used. It cracks and crumbles under the pressures of life like clay in a season of drought. How can the American Negro's past be used? The unprecedented price demanded, and at this embattled hour of the world's history, is the transcendence of the realities of color, of nations, and of altars. The transcendence of the realities of color, of nations, and of altars. So in order to use this past, not a past that's been invented, but a level and reasoned and perhaps impassioned understanding of the reality of what persons of every color, especially Black Americans, have been subjected to across the history of the United States, requires, in Baldwin's view, that this price be paid, right? that the realities of color, of nations, and of altars be transcended. What does it mean to transcend something? To ascend is to go up, to descend is to go down, and to transcend is to go over, right? To go over, to move beyond in some way. Now, he's not calling for what we would call today, in a straightforward sense, color blindness, that we simply pretend that race does not exist, but that in all of the robustness of our personal differences from one another, there be a common and universal recognition of humanity, of each of us as a person with dignity and rights, regardless of our color, of our nation, or of our religious creed, what he calls here our altars. I submit this to all of you for your reflection and our discussion. This is a important passage as Baldwin contemplates where differing approaches to the struggle for justice might lead. I've given it this title, A Spiritual Wasteland. He writes, I am very much concerned that American Negroes achieve their freedom here in the United States, period. But I am also concerned for their dignity, for the health of their souls, and must oppose any attempt that Negroes may make to do to others what has been done to them. I think I know, we see it around us every day, the spiritual wasteland to which that road leads. It is so simple a fact, and one that is so hard apparently to grasp. Baldwin's italics, whoever debases others is debasing himself. Again, whoever debases others is debasing himself. That is not a mystical statement, but a most realistic one, which is proved by the eyes of any Alabama sheriff, and I would not like to see Negroes ever arrive at so wretched a condition. What does Baldwin see in the eyes of this Alabama sheriff? Right? He sees a debasement of that person's self as a result of that person's debasement of others. I would propose, as your professor in the theology of the civil rights movement course, what are we looking at here? We're looking at something very close to what Thurman said about hatred, right? That hatred feels righteous, it feels good, it feels that you are doing the right thing in response to a manifest and unacceptable injustice, right? And indeed, that injustice may be manifest and unacceptable. But if the response to that is hatred, or as per King, if that response is violence, what I hear him echoing here is that you will, in that gesture of hatred and violence, debase yourself, that you're going low when they go low. We can say with Michelle Obama, right? When they go low, we go high, right? And this is what I see Baldwin as calling for here. Yes, to achieve freedom for Black Americans here in the United States, but yes, also in the doing, right, to ensure that their dignity, the health of their souls, be upheld, and that they, for their own good, not descend into hatred and violence, that they not, in being debased by others, in response, debase themselves. So Baldwin is not here, as I see it, taking up the full sweep of King's nonviolent resistance, practice of nonviolent resistance, but he is saying something that to my ears harmonizes with it. I'll be interested to hear what folks think about that. To be integrated into a burning house. If we, Baldwin writes, who can scarcely be considered a white nation, talking about the United States, persist in thinking of ourselves as one, we condemn ourselves with the truly white nations to sterility and decay. Whereas, if we could accept ourselves as we are, we might bring new life to the Western achievements and transform them. The price of this transformation is the unconditional freedom of the Negro. It is not too much to say that he, who has been so long rejected, must now be embraced, and at no matter what psychic or social risk. He is the key figure in his country. He is the key figure in his country. And the American future is precisely as bright or as dark as his. And the Negro recognizes this in a negative way. Hence the question, do I really want to be integrated into a burning house? Do I really want to be integrated into a burning house? Right? No house divided against itself can long stand. Right? Well, here we have the United States envisioned as a house. Right? And we have here those who persist in thinking of ourselves as a white nation. Right? And Baldwin's prognosis here is what? This will lead to sterility and decay. Right? Because we are not a white nation. We are as we are, right? We are a diverse nation, persons of many backgrounds. I think it's notable here also what he says at the end, that the person he calls the Negro, Black Americans, this is the key figure in his country. The American future is precisely as bright or as dark as his. Right? If this country persists, writes Baldwin, 1963, right, in segregation, in hatred, Jim Crow laws, redlining, all of these things about which we will have learned from various sources, the future of the country is dim, and the house of this country is burning, right? And so to integrate into a situation like that, into a white nation, is not for Baldwin the end, and is not for Baldwin a desirable outcome, or would it be for anyone in his view, right? What needs to happen, and we see this running as a theme throughout the book, is people need to, as it were, wake up, right, to the reality of the history of the country, and to the reality of relations between so-called black and so-called white persons in this country, and to the reality of the human dignity of all persons in this country, regardless of their identity. This will be our last one. This is at the very end of the book. I think it is actually our last passage. If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the others. If we do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. If we do not now dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy, recreated from the Bible in a song by a slave, is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time. This, of course, is the title of the book, The Fire Next Time. The story he's referring to here is, of course, the story, well-known story of Noah's Ark. All right, so God looks upon the earth and sees people engaging in violence, and hatred, other terrible practices. He decides he's going to wipe the earth clean. He's going to send a flood, drown everything, and basically start over. It's kind of a dry run, messed up, right? But then he sees Noah, and Noah is a virtuous and decent person. And so Noah is told to build this ark and take two of each of the animals, and we know the story. And the waters rise, and the waters eventually recede, and the ark is again on dry land, and the animals come out, and the world is repopulated. There we have our story from the book of Genesis in the Bible. And as a sign, at the end of that episode of God seeing such hatred and violence and wiping the world clean, right? God puts in the sky, in our story, the rainbow. And the rainbow is, as it were, like an archer setting down God's bow to indicate that God will no longer, or will never again, destroy the earth by flood. And that's what the story says. God promises never to destroy the earth by a flood. Now you might say, okay, well, lots of different ways to destroy the earth. So you're not going to do it by a flood. What are you going to do, right? Well, here we have that prospect, right? That the world will no longer be destroyed by God in a flood, but next time the destruction might be far worse and far more total. And remember, we're writing here at the very center of the Cold War, with a nuclear standoff that's at the forefront of the minds of all in the early 1960s. The Cuban Missile Crisis is around the same time. The fire next time, right? So if society persists in the patterns of living and thinking and racism and discrimination of all kinds, the result will not be what it was. There will not be a Noah in an ark, right? The destruction could be total. And so to seek to end the racial nightmare, achieve our country, and change the history of the world is not for Baldwin an optional outcome, like something nice we might choose to do. But as he said in the previous slide, this is the future of our country. The future of our country depends on this, right? We must achieve our country, right? There's a lot of nice language in our founding documents, but that language needs to be made real. And the language needs to be realized, in Baldwin's view. The country, as described, drawn up in those documents, needs to be achieved. It's not achieved on its own. It's achieved insofar as we are willing to achieve it. And so, James Baldwin's book, The Fire Next Time. I do hope you enjoy the reading of this book and having focused on these passages from it. I hope that this identification of themes was helpful for you. And enjoy especially just the poetic and the beautiful quality and the profound sincerity and thoughtfulness and insight of Baldwin's text. It's something from which I believe today we have a great deal still to learn.